For a second lesson, words from the book of the Acts of the Apostles, the 2nd chapter. So those who welcomed his message were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to their company. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread together and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. And day by day they spent much time together in the temple, and they also broke bread in their homes together and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. She sits in front of me wringing her hands. Dark lines under her eyes. She's not been sleeping well. She's unable to get going in the morning. She had thought they were headed for marriage, but after his last trip, he had called to say that it was all off. Now she doesn't know what to do. She feels empty. She's wondering whether there's any reason to go on. He chats with friends, but they note silently that some of the old vigor seems to have departed. The purchase of a company, his company, by British Combine had relieved him of his executive position. The golden parachute was more than adequate, but he seems moody, a little vague, and lacking in direction. The young man just received his grades, and now it's clear that architecture is out as a future for him, but that's all he had ever wanted, and now nothing seems to matter. He knows his parents will be disappointed. He's drinking too much, unable to concentrate, get on with life. She's in a strange mood. The last child just left, yet she can't seem to get excited about her newfound freedom. There's a kind of emptiness about her life that leaves her listless, sad. Judith Viorst portrays herself this way at one time of her life. Why do I seem to remember Pearl Harbor? Surely I must be too young. When did the boys I once clung to start losing their hair? Why can't I take barefoot walks in the park without giving my kidneys a chill? There's poetry left in me still, and it doesn't seem fair. While I was thinking I was just a girl, my future turned into my past. The time for wild kisses goes fast, and it's time for Sanka. What's the picture? People who have lost and are depressed, all loss, death of the dog, change of home, start of college, friends leaving town, the arthritic knee that shuts you down. All loss depresses, and wherever there is depression, there is some loss acknowledged or unnoticed, embraced or repressed. You can count on it. If you feel particularly down this morning, you ought to ask what you lost yesterday, if you can remember. There's the politician who lost the election overwhelmingly and who got up in front of his supporters and said, "I'm reminded of an epitaph I saw on an old tombstone. I expected this, but not so soon." And there seems to be more of it in our time. If W.H. Auden could call the 50s the age of anxiety, I have the impulse to call the 90s the age of depression. I'm not talking really about clinical depression, which we assume is genetic and for which we have pharmacology now. I'm talking about garden variety depression. I'm talking about the blues, sense of discouragement about life, which emerges some days as lack of energy or a kind of sadness or immobility or loss of meaning or kind of anger at the way the world is. I think we see more of that now. Maybe it's because we experience more losses in our modern world. Our young people seem to sense the loss of a secure future. I've met middle-aged management types who feel the loss of certainty about their career track. There's the sense that grave social problems may be in fact intractable, and that feels like loss to a people who are accustomed to solving problems rather than enduring them. I think some of us feel the breakdown of moral consensus as a kind of loss out there. Even the end of the Cold War represents loss to some of us. There's a professor down at the University of Illinois who said 5 years ago that we would one day look back in nostalgia upon the simplicities of East-West confrontation. There's the loss associated with the changing landscape of so many of our lives, the transiency of relationships, the dislocation of changing communities, the loss of a bright future about which we once felt collectively as a people, typified by our dismay before violence and educational disaster and economic uncertainty. We've even learned to read hopeful signs as bad. Charles Osgood pointed out the other day that economists are now saying that the market is depressed because the economy is doing so well. And you add all this to the normal losses of life that we all run into, whether it be loss of youth or loss of health or loss of loved ones and friends. And it's no wonder that life at times seems sad and futile, tinged with despair for ordinary folk like you and me. Elizabeth Janeway writes, "Sometimes I wake up in the morning and feel hopeful, even to the extent of saying with William Faulkner that man will not only survive, he will prevail. But sometimes I wake up in the morning and feel that James Thurber and Woody Allen are right, and the thrips, Dutch elm disease, tangled synapses, and the claws of the sea pus will get us all in the end." Today's a so-so day. Why do I belabor all this? Because the consequences of it can be very serious. This discouragement about life, this depression of spirit, is a grave matter whether you're talking about individual health and prosperity or whether you're talking about national mood and madness. Because depression and despair are killers. Down at Menninger's in Topeka, Kansas, that's kind of the Mayo Brothers of the mental health world, over 50% of their patients today are under 30. And a large number are adolescents. And a professor friend of mine down there says, kind of at the core of everything else they're trying to deal with is a lack of hope about their future. Discouragement, disillusionment, cynicism, despair can infect us as individuals. It can infect community and national mood so that solutions to a better future are foreclosed. One writer in New York Times Magazine said of the French something that may well be true of us. They've gone to such extremes of discouragement that they're actually precipitating what they're worrying about. One economist writes, "Pessimism in our time is infinitely more respectable than optimism. A man who foresees peace and prosperity and a decline in juvenile delinquency is a negligent fool. A man who foresees catastrophe has a gift of insight which ensure that he will become a television commentator, an editor of Time magazine, or maybe even go to Congress." Our personal and national well-being depend upon our ability to cope with the prevailing depression and despair in the world around us. But how do you do that? Do you just look on the bright side? You know, see the half-full glass instead of the half-empty glass? Well, that's not bad. It may help a bit. But what if the glass is totally empty? Really, in reality? I wish to insist the only answer is an attitude toward the future, which was born a long time ago, an attitude toward the future which is not grounded in anything we can see and calculate, not the sky at sunset, not the charts or graphs, not the polls, not the occasional positive accomplishments of the politicians. The only answer is what an old story calls, hear me, hope in God. Because hope in God, by definition, is not hope based on what we've got in our hands, but it is hope based on the possibility that God can do something with tomorrow that we can't even begin to anticipate. It is faith that the future holds possibilities that you can't even begin to wish for, precisely because to us now they are hidden in the wisdom and providence of God. John Gardner out at Stanford, no preacher, writes, "Our conscious processes, the part of us that is saturated with words and ideas, may arrive at gloomy appraisals, but an older, more deeply rooted and spiritually stubborn part of us ought to continue to say yes to hope, yes to striving, yes to life." Or there's Gordon Allport, the psychologist, who affirms ultimately it is only the religious hope that upholds a man against disaster. While it is true that any type of personal hope will give you something to live for, it is only hope in God that holds everything in place and gives meaning to suffering as to joy. But let me give you an illustration. Deborah, beautiful 38-year-old former model and mother of 2 teenage boys, was dying of cancer. She'd already undergone surgery, but some of the cancer had either evaded the scalpel or had metastasized to another area. Because the woman was in an extremely weakened condition, the surgeon called in a consulting physician to help determine whether or not Deborah would be able to withstand further surgery. After examining her, the consulting physician told her he was going to recommend against further surgery. "You don't think I'm strong enough to survive it?" she said. The doctor replied, "In my professional opinion, weighing your condition against the risk of surgery, looking at the facts compared to the potential benefits." And then he says he broke off his response because he just was unable to finish telling the woman that he saw no hope. But Deborah had other ideas. "I want you to change your recommendation," she said. Then she pointed to a silver goblet that she always kept on the table beside her bed, whether at home or the hospital. "My father gave me this cup when I was a little girl," she explained. "Read the inscription." The doctor picked it up and read aloud, "My cup runneth over." Then Deborah said, "My father told me a long time ago that the cup of life is never half empty or half full. It's always overflowing with possibilities." He said it didn't matter what terrible things came along. If I had conviction, if I trusted in God, my cup would never run dry. My cup would be a source of life and inspiration and strength and love and everything I would ever need. "Doctor, my cup still runneth over. It will never run dry. I will have the surgery, and somehow I will survive, and I will live to see my 2 boys become men. You doctors take care of my body. God and I will take care of the rest." This is what that consulting physician wrote thereafter. Deborah had surgery, and she did survive and lived to see her 2 boys become men. Was her survival a statistical quirk or spontaneous remission, whatever that is, or a tribute to the genius of the surgeon? Maybe. But I've seen enough patients in my time to know that the ones who are convinced that their cups run over do better than those who see their cups running dry. Now, does this mean that those who succumb finally do so because they fail to have hope? By no means. I've buried a lot of dear friends who courageously held out hope until the very last hour. After all, the mortality rate in life for all of us is 100%. It means, though, that as we hope in God, at least 3 things can happen. One is, until we're gone, we'll always keep open possibilities that otherwise we might not see. And we receive the strength to go through whatever comes with good spirit. You know, disease or difficulty may finally get our body, but it need not get us. And finally, such hope draws us together in a life of love and joy. Faith fantasizes a new future. That is, hope in God opens up new possibilities. It keeps us open and searching, whereas depression and despair close us off in present so-called realities. There's a marvelous story that Robert Schuller tells about Christy Wilson, an educator who was working in Afghanistan, American. A few years ago, there was a near wipeout of Afghanistan's leading industry, which was and is sheep breeding. A fatal disease had entered the flocks and stubbornly resisted all efforts to eradicate it. And with the entire sheep industry in danger of extinction, it meant there was loss of wool for clothing, leather for commercial products, and food to eat. And in a country already suffering massive poverty, the potential losses were catastrophic. Christy Wilson's a Christian, and he began to think and pray, and his prayer became a search for ideas, for answers, for a way ahead. And then he says one day the fantasy came, as out of nowhere. Write to your friends in the United States and ask them to send you some Long Island ducks. So he did it. And not long afterwards, 24 duck eggs were shipped air freight from New York, but they didn't reach Afghanistan directly. The shipment was sidetracked and spent a lot of hot days in a warehouse in Calcutta. When the package finally arrived in Kabul, some of the eggs were cracked and smelled rotten. And Christy thought, oh God, you know, let at least 2 eggs hatch and let one of them be a male and one of them be a female. And guess what? 22 eggs proved to be infertile, 2 hatched, and 1 was a male, and 1 was a female. And the ducks began to reproduce, and the offspring multiplied, and then the ducks began to devour snails that crawled along the watering holes where the sheep went to drink. And amazingly, the fatal sheep disease began to disappear because the snails had proved to be the carriers of the disease. And today in Afghanistan, ducks and sheep are both in abundance, and Christy Wilson has been cited and honored by the government for his service. Now, what a marvelous chain of events, coincidences, whatever you want to call them. But to me, the real wonder lies in that initial crazy, out-of-left-field idea to send, for of all things, Long Island duck eggs. A product of his own imagination, you may say. But would he have ever come up with it if he not had some kind of faith against the hard realities, the obvious realities of the moment? Faith to believe, to hope, to search, to grope for some way ahead. So a hoping faith is a faith that knows how to fantasize a different, better future than any of the facts seem to forebode in the moment. It keeps us open to possibilities. Of course, you can carry it too far. Bishop of the Methodist Church, John Hart, tells of visiting a woman in his congregation at the local retirement home on the occasion of her 100th birthday. He says her mind was sharp as a tack, and she really got caught up in the excitement of the occasion, so much so that in the midst of the festivities, when a reporter asked her the simple question, "Do you have any children?" she blurted out, "Not yet." Hope in God enables us to think, to believe, to live toward new possibilities. That is, hope in God gives us feet to our hopes, sets us moving toward the future we are hoping for, even as depression and despair tend to immobilize us, do they not? Often the only way out of our sadness and discouragement is a step at a time, forcing ourselves to make moves toward a better kind of future. One of the most unusual stories to emerge from the darkness of the Holocaust comes from the concentration camp at Buchenwald. There was a group of Jewish physicians who were also prisoners and who followed the same crushing routine as everybody else. They arose at 4 a.m. in the morning, they stood and shivered through the roll calls, they worked at the day-long drudgery on the Autobahn, and finally they received a cold bowl of thin soup at day's end. They were starved and overworked like all the other prisoners, with no reason to expect any other fate than the death that they saw around them day in and day out. But a strange thing happened. While the other prisoners were asleep, these weary doctors got up and began to huddle together secretly in a group and talk into the night. They began to discuss cases with one another. They presented and prepared papers for one another. They made plans for improving the health conditions of a death camp. Then they had the idea of trying to build an X-ray machine. The pieces had to be stolen and concealed in their clothes, and the guards had to be bribed for some critical pieces, but slowly, with the help of other prisoners who were engineers and electricians, they were able to put together a workable primitive X-ray machine, and they used it secretly at night in their efforts to diagnose and treat their fellow prisoners in a death camp. But those physicians who survived later confessed to their liberators that it was this hopeful, night after night labor together that kept them alive, while others simply gave up and died, because they gave feet to their hope. But notice also that it not only gave them feet, it gave them fellowship, it drew them together in closeness and camaraderie. Hope generates community, even as despair generates isolation. Thomas Oden of Drew University was recently able to slip into Cuba, even though he's a persona non grata down there. But he has found in Cuba a revival of faith and hope affecting the whole spectrum of the Christian community, from Roman Catholic to Baptist. Why? Because it is the only community left in that sad country that still has the capacity to hope for the future. The stark absence of hope among everybody else is a function of the failure of socialism, where humanistic hopes were elevated so high and then have been dashed in these recent years. And the Christian community alone is the community that says, yet there can be future. He met for a pre-breakfast coffee with a venerable old professor who has witnessed 3 generations of change there, and asked him where their hope came from. And he said, well, we've learned that God always illumines the next step. Not long distances ahead. We'd like to be illumined for the whole distance ahead, but the flickering light of his word only shows the next step. You remember, he said, God called Abraham, leave Ur, and then I'll tell you what you're going to do. To Paul, he said, go to the next city, and I'll tell you there what next. And even the risen Lord said to his disciples, go to Galilee, and you'll find me there. And it's humbling for us not to know what is over the next hill, not to have any more foreknowledge than the next guy. But this is precisely a part of our spiritual training here, to learn to take small steps without knowing what's over the hill, small steps together, trusting our God. So we've learned it's not enough that our students have food to eat and books to read. They've got to learn to look to God for tomorrow with every sunrise. It's all there in the picture of the first Christians in the little story I read you from the book of Acts. They know about suffering and death all too well, in their own bodies and in the body of their Lord. They know about all the losses that we also know about. But they also know that these are not the future, that beyond all losses in life, there is resurrection and new life. And so what do? They get together to imagine and practice and sing about the future they hope for. And there are Christians all over this world today who are doing exactly that, gathering together to imagine and practice and sing about the future they hope for. And that's what we're going to do right now. Amen.